Good news, everybody. The Ryzen 9 7950X is launching today. Well, okay, technically tomorrow. This is the Ryzen 9 CPU that features 144 megs of cache. Yeah, tons of cache. 16 cores, PCIe 5 nanometer processes. 5x5 in the 5. Yeah, I don't know. And it works well with Linux, but there's some things we gotta talk about. First, hello, welcome. Sorry I'm long overdue for a video. I've been working on myself. It shows. Fun times. Gonna try to do more Linux content. Now that that train is sort of back on the rails. No, that's not a reference to current events or anything like that. But you know what's not a train derailment? 16 cores for the 7950X. Now, if you've been living under a rock and you need me to catch you up, AMD's actually launching 3 CPUs with V-Cache. The 16 core, the 12 core, and the 8 core. Now, I've got the 16 core here. I should have the 12 core really soon. In a couple of weeks, AMD is also launching the 8 core because everybody would wonder, hey, where's the 8 core? But the 8 core is not launching today. This is the 16 core. And something that makes it a little interesting, it was pretty interesting on Windows, they needed some software to deal with this, is that only one of your 2 CCDs comes with V-Cache. But this creates an interesting situation because V-Cache sort of creates some limitations in terms of power and thermals. This is 120 watt TDP CPU. Now, I mean, it's going to consume more than 120 watts, but that means that this uses less power than a 7950X. And we'll see that in benchmarks for multi-core and even compile workloads, where compiling is usually a cache benchmark if your project is large enough. The 7950X 3D is just a hair slower than the 7950X, which is a pretty interesting situation. Now, in games, you do see performance uplift in games, and we'll talk about that. But overall, the architecture here is one of your 8-core CCDs has the stack of V-Cache, and the other one does not. And you're in a more power-limited scenario. Now, it does support overclocking if you want to do precision boost overdrive and modify the opportunistic boosts with Fmax tuning, that sort of thing. But it does not support fine-grained directed overclocking. So you can't create a situation where the CPU is on the struggle bus in terms of power or thermals because the 3D V-Cache die situation is what it is inside the CPU. You can, however, choose some really interesting stuff in the BIOS of your motherboard to do with which CCD you want to prioritize, because the non-V-Cache CCD is going to be able to clock higher and use more power than the V-Cache CCD. So if you're running mostly jobs that'll benefit from the 64 megabytes of extra L3 cache, then you can tell the BIOS, hey, prioritize that, and that will cascade down through the Linux configuration. In fact, there's some hints for you on the Level 1 forum if you're going to run games, Steam games and some other things like that. You can prioritize games to be shuttled over to the V-Cache CPU, which is generally better for games, but there are some games, esports games mainly, that don't really benefit from the extra V-Cache. If you're running mostly jobs that don't use V-Cache, then you can shuttle those over to the other CCD, which is the more frequency optimized. You know, we're talking 5.7 gigahertz max boost out of the box. Now, in terms of the Linux experience, how does this stack up to the 13900K or the 13900KS? Well, on Linux, this is a better experience than the 13900K or the 13900KS for a lot of reasons. One, to get similar performance out of the 13900K and KS, you're going to need really fast DDR5. It's a little bit more of a roll the dice situation than it is on the AMD platform with AM5. DDR5 6000 support in the form of Expo. I have yet to get an AM5 CPU that has any trouble at all with Expo memory configurations running at DDR5 6000. That's kind of a sweet spot in terms of latency and other configuration. For this system, I'm using G.Skill Trident Z. It's the CL36 timing DDR5 6000 kit that they have, so 2 sticks of memory. In general, for the AM5 platform, I recommend only using 2 sticks of memory. You can use 64 gigabytes, pretty soon 96 gigabytes. That'll be a lot of fun. But 4 sticks of memory at the really high clock speed doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, Linux gaming, in some scenarios, lags a little bit behind the Windows counterparts. For this CPU, we're seeing a performance delta of 10, 15, 20% in some cases between the 13900K and the 7950X3D. Just depends on the game. When you factor in the KS and the higher clocked memory, the performance narrows to about 7-8%. Generally, it varies, depends on the game, depends on a whole bunch of other parameters. On Linux, it's pretty much the same story. If you look at the compile benchmarks, it pretty much follows the same pattern as the actual gaming benchmarks, because performance on gaming on Linux, especially when we're talking about Steam and Proton, a little bit more varied. The Vulkan shaders and the upgrades and everything else to do with that, a little bit of a mixed bag, and nothing to do with the 7950X CPU, the extra cache, or any of the changes to the CPU to support this. Now, the other thing that's really nice is when you're on Linux, you're dealing with mixed performance and efficiency cores. And with this, even though the cores are mixed a little bit, you're not really dealing with dramatic differences between the cores. So things like virtualization, shuttling busy processes running inside a virtual machine between the different CCDs, not really an issue. And yes, you can pin your virtual machine so that it only runs on one CCD or the other, depending on what it is that you want to do. But this is an easier sort of balancing act than juggling processes between performance and efficiency cores. I mean, don't forget the 13900K is 24 cores total. It's 16 of the efficiency cores, if you want to call those cores. They don't hyperthread. And then 8 other performance cores that do high performance and do actually support 2 threads per core. So it's always been a little bit of a mixed bag. We don't have something as good as Thread Director on Linux yet, but Intel's been doing a lot of work on that. Whereas with the 7950X3D, it basically works out of the box, assuming you get your BIOS update for your motherboard. I can't wait to take a look at the 12-core version of this CPU. I think that'll also make a really good Linux workstation. It's 6 cores per CCD instead of 8 cores per CCD, but you still get the full 64 megabytes bump in L3 cache on one of your CCDs. And I think AMD's probably going to get a lot of criticism for not also launching the 8-core at once, because the 8-core, if you're into gaming and you mainly just want gaming, then obviously the 8-core with Vcache is what you're going to do. And all of your cores will have access to that increased L3 cache. You won't need any extra software configuration. You won't need to do anything with core pinning. You won't need to do anything with core parking, which is what the AMD software does on the Windows side of things when the system's not super busy, to keep all 16 cores running and doing stuff, which worked better than I expected, if I'm being honest. So the Linux experience here actually is really good, and this would make for a good mixed use workstation, gaming machine, something like that, where you're not going to splash out for like the full, $5, $6, $8, $10,000 workstation. 16 cores on the AM5 platform is a very, very competent, very capable system that you can work with. And pretty soon you're going to be able to run 128 gigabytes of memory with just 2 DIMMs, it looks like. So that's pretty exciting times. For SSD performance, I was using the P5800X Intel Optane, which is a very fast, very low latency SSD for a lot of my benchmarks. So game load times and stuff like that didn't really factor in very much. Now for the compile benchmarks though, I was actually using a RAID 0 of 4 older, slower Intel 1 terabyte NVMe, which may have factored into some of the scores. Some of the larger compile jobs were actually the same speed or a little bit faster with the 7950X3D versus the 7950X. But in general, the 7950X was just a little bit slower, not dramatically so, than the 7950X, owing to the reduced power target, 120 watt TDP, reduced clocks that we see on the Vcache core and that sort of thing. For things that involve, computational fluid dynamics, things that will benefit from 64 megabytes of cache, obviously that's improved with this CPU, but that's going to vary greatly depending on what your specific workload is. And it's probably also fair to say that the performance delta here with the 7000 series CPUs is not quite as much relative to everything else as we saw with the 5000 series CPUs. That 8-core 5800X3D, that was the 1-2 knockout punch for gaming performance. With the 7950X, the same 64 meg bump in L3 cache, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag on the AM5 platform, which has been a little surprising. Overall, I'm pleased to see that the Linux support for 3D Vcache is pretty good out the gate. I was running the very latest bleeding edge Git repo version of the Linux kernel as of February 22nd, 2023, so it doesn't even really exactly sort of kind of have a release tag. There's a couple features in my kernel that are slated for kernel 6.3. AMD's added a ton of new features for their CPU and their GPU. In fact, my system is so bleeding edge that AMD accidentally broke support for the 7900 XTX in this setup because Mesa and the firmware, everything's a little bit out of sync. And I'm also running Fedora, so it's like kind of hard mode when it comes to the AMD GPU side of things. If you're content running the NVIDIA binary blobs, performance is pretty good in terms of game performance and everything else. Or if you're on a 6800, 6900, 6000 series GPU, again, no problem with the bleeding edge kernel. I've got a guide that I've been working on and off on the Level 1 forum, and then this broke about a week and a half ago, give or take, and I've been trying to distill that down into a how-to on the Level 1 forum. Been running a little behind on that, but have been doing that kind of content, so I'm keeping it together. It's not too bad. I'm really excited about the 7950X 3D launch and what it means for accessible productivity and that sort of thing. The pricing from AMD is what it is. You could roll the dice and see if the pricing comes down in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, depending on volume. And the general PC sales market overall is not in good shape right now in terms of sales volumes. People aren't buying things. The overall macroeconomic conditions, not sure what that means for parts prices and availability and everything else. Overall, in the grand scheme of things, what AMD is asking for this processor in terms of price, I think is reasonable. And there are much more affordable AM5 motherboards that are just starting to come out the last couple of weeks, and some more on the horizon that have been announced by various motherboard partners. For my testing, I mostly used the ASRock Taichi X670E. It's a great board, you should check it out. I wish I had more PCIe slots. I wish all the AM5 motherboards that I have had more PCIe slots. Also did some testing with the Asus Hero X670 motherboard. That worked really well. Asus is putting their own special sauce in terms of the algorithm chooser and the ACPI tables and things like that for prioritizing one CCD over the other, and some of their own special sauce in terms of the overclock. I found the Taichi board a little bit more stable on Linux in that regard, because I think that Asus is sort of targeting the Windows experience first, but those features did work on Linux. So good job, Asus, and thanks for all the soup on the Linux side of things. It's something that we like to have whenever we can get it. So, I do have some ECC DDR5 DIMMs. That's unregistered ECC, because registered and unregistered are physically different in the DDR5 generation. I've been trying to do ECC testing on the ASRock platform. It's kind of supported, kind of not, gray area. I'm not sure about that. It's a little strange. That's going to have to wait for another video. I'm Whittle, this is Level 1. This has been the launch of the 7950X 3D. I'm looking forward to the 7900X 3D, and especially the 7800X 3D. If you have any questions or comments, or something you'd like to see me test with this platform, or this platform plus the 7900 XTX, or other configurations, let me know. I get the hardware. It's just a question of time and figuring out what you want to see. And hey, I'm going to try to get more content done for this channel. All right, I'm signing out, and you can find me in the Level 1 forums.